Well, good afternoon and welcome to Deep Fried Planet with me, Pat Thomas. Our topic today is water. Now, a whole convergence of situations, including climate change, an expanding global population, a slavish adherence to economic growth means that we are fast approaching the moment when oil wars may be superseded by water wars. There is, of course, more than one kind of water. There's the water we use directly every day to cook, to wash, to drink. And then there is virtual water, the enormous amounts of hidden water embedded in the products we use every day. In the UK, our direct water use is around 150 litres per person per day, about the size of a very large bath. But our virtual water use, hidden in the clothes we wear, our computers, cosmetics and cars, and most especially in the food that we eat, increases that water footprint to a staggering 3,400 litres. This virtual water is particularly troubling because it is economically invisible and politically silent, and therefore it enables politicians and public officials to avoid talking about what is a really tricky issue. And it encourages a kind of paralysis or action to make the necessary reforms in policy is what is sorely needed. Now, you may be one of those people who's getting a bit tired of hearing the word crisis attached to everything in your daily life. But imagine a world without water, without the ability to simply turn on a tap and get as much as you want or you need. And unlike oil, there's no alternative for water. There's no water substitute. You let this thought really settle into your bones, and then maybe perhaps crisis isn't a strong enough word. So to sort it all out today, with me in the studio is Jacob Tompkins, Director of the UK charity Waterwise, and Professor Peter Guthrie, Head of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Cambridge University, and lead author of the report Global Water Security and Engineering Perspective, which was published earlier this year. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. We hear a lot about peak oil. In fact, have we reached the moment of peak water?
I don't know whether we can discuss water in the same terms that we discuss energy. I mean, everyone will have done at school the water cycle. And, you know, the thing that we quite often get back to us was surely it all just goes around in one big circle. But if you think about it, it's the amount of water that we actually have to drink is a drop in a bucket. Most water is salt water or trapped in deep aquifers or trapped in ice. And the bit that we use, the bit that we drink, the bit that we grow our food with, is a very, very small proportion of that goes round and round. And if we pollute that, or we use it, or we abuse it so that it's in the wrong place, or so that seas dry up, I mean, we've seen this with places like the Aral Sea, there are major problems. So when people look at the sea, or all of the ice, and think, oh, there's loads of water, we can't use that.
No. Is it a problem of access or supply, Peter, do you think?
Well, I think to build on Jacob's point, it's also very much a problem of identification of what it is we're talking about, because water is the stuff of life. It's everywhere around us. It's in vapor form. It's in ice. It's in snow. We can be troubled by it when it's a flood and we have too much of it, and we are troubled by it when there's not enough of it, when there's a drought. And in our report, what we tried to do is to separate out three types of water: green water, which is the water that we grow our crops with and that feed the land; blue water, which is the water, the free water, as it were, in rivers and reservoirs, not seawater, which is the vast majority, of course; and wastewater, which is grey water; and foul water, which is we also call black water. But these different types of water gave us an ability to talk in the language of different types of water, so water being treated differently. And I think we need to understand that whilst you talked about the amount of water per person per day, countries in stress are when there's less than 1,700 cubic metres of water available per person. So the volumes of total water are really quite impressive. But below those levels, we're into water stress, and many countries are already in a state of water stress.
And what does that mean for us? Let's start at the basic level. For me as a consumer, as a person who's going to go home tonight and have a bath, what does that water stress mean? What's the future?
Well, Jacob will talk more about what happens in piped water, because there's a whole relationship between water and energy. When we have free water that falls from the sky, there's been very little energy that we have to do with associated with that. But when we have treated water coming out of our taps, there's been a huge amount of energy associated with collecting it, piping it, moving it around, treating it, purifying it, and then treating it when it's waste. So we need to be very careful about piped water, particularly because it has such a high level of investment, which has a carbon content associated with it.
I think to give an example in the UK, if you look around a year ago, we had devastating floods in the Lake District that killed people, awful floods. And then it didn't rain. And we had a hosepipe ban. And that's the fragility of what we're talking about. And at that point, United Utilities, the water supply company there, did not have enough supply to maintain public supply. That's why they had to bring in hosepipe bans. So in a country where we think it's very wet and we have massively developed infrastructure, there are short-term shortages. And as we see the change in climate and as we see growth in use and as we see population growth, we will see that suddenly the things we've taken for granted, flushing the toilet, turning on the tap, maybe won't be there. That's at a local level. At an international level, what water shortage maybe means for a consumer, think about coffee. Coffee is grown in specific areas, mainly equatorial, mainly uplands, and it's all rain-fed. Now, if you get slight changes in rainfall patterns, suddenly you couldn't possibly irrigate coffee. The idea of putting in irrigation systems for coffee is massive. So what you would see was coffee quadrupling in price. And that's at the supermarket. Now, how many supermarkets have thought about the fragility of their supply chains? So that's just a very small example of what it means globally. And we're connected to that. So you are connected to rainfall in Rwanda and places like this, specifically through supermarket aisles of coffee. There are the links. There is another link, and this is the link with infrastructure, energy infrastructure. A really good and frightening example is 2006 when we had power cuts in Europe. That's because the levels of flow in the Rhone fell below the intakes for the nuclear power station, so they couldn't cool them. They couldn't then supply electricity, and there wasn't electricity for the water treatment plants. So they had no water and no electricity, just because of a lack of snowmelt and a lack of rain. All of these things are interlinked, and before we think, oh yeah, that's the French, look at the floods we had in Gloucester, where the floods knocked out a water treatment plant. So you had massive flooding and 250,000 people without water. Our infrastructure, and these are the things that are highlighted, and these are the questions that engineers need to ask. Our infrastructure is very fragile. It looks great on the surface, but small changes in weather, and particularly in relation to water, make us very, very vulnerable.
Now, this is all in a world where we treat water to drinking quality standard and then use it to flush our toilets, which is crazy.
Yes, it's an incredible waste, and I think most people have kind of got an idea that of those sorts of links where energy is concerned, but water is a whole new ball game for most of us. This idea that when we go to the supermarket and we buy our Kenyan green beans, why on earth would you buy Kenyan green beans when we grow them here? But never mind. We buy them and we realize that actually we're buying water from a country that is officially water stressed. And so there is a sort of personal responsibility there, and I do understand that. But I do wonder whether it's only the consumer that can solve this, or whether there is an engineering solution or a political solution or what have you.
Well, the solutions, there is a sort of that way that water is being in one place, people in another. But I think that the more deep question is that we need, in local context everywhere in the world, to look at water catchment areas in a holistic, integrated way. And we need to manage the whole process of water rainfall, capture, management, treatment, flow, and that water cycle, the hydrological cycle that everybody's shown at school that Jacob was talking about earlier on. It always misses out one vital thing, and that is that not in the hydrological cycle, the sea is always mentioned on the right-hand side. But actually, between catchments, sometimes the export of one catchment is the import of another catchment. And so the quality of treatment, maybe from one country to another country or one catchment to another country in a different state, are really important issues that are not generally picked up by engineers and institutions that think about these things in a political sense.
Jacob?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think it's we've got to address this at three levels. It's got to be government, it's got to be engineers, but it's got to be individuals. And there's a worry that by saying, oh, look at virtual water and it's all really big, it absolves us as individuals from doing anything. I would like everybody to go out and think, where is their local river? Where is your local river? And then go and have a look at it. Is it in a large concrete pipe under a road somewhere? Why is that? Why don't we have access to that river? How is the water used? How is it polluted? Write to your local newspaper and say, I wanted to go for a walk with the dog and the kids by the river, but I found it was in a big pipe. Why is that? Because humans love water.
Yes.
You know, there is an intrinsic link. If you look at where we go on holiday, you know, it's by rivers, it's on frozen water, it's by the sea. There is that link, and we've abused that in the same way. You know, we've just talked about that water cycle, and now that that's been effectively broken, the classical one we learned in school, we're importing and exporting water all over the place. We're exploiting water a lot more within that. We are not valuing water enough, and that's what this whole thing boils down to, and that's globally, but that is individually, and I'll hold my hand up as well, even though I run a water NGO.
Well, it seems to me to be linked to this idea of growth and rising living standards. You know, water use rises as our living standards rise, and I'm not talking necessarily about more hot baths here, but the rising consumption of goods, particularly the sort of global food culture that we're enjoying at the moment. So is the answer yet another label to put on our foods or our goods to say this is how much water it used?
Well, it'd be very nice to think that a label would sort out the problem, but it's not going to be that simple. And I think one of the things that the government's chief scientist, Sir John Beddington, has understood is that he can see that there is a relationship between water, energy and food that needs to be much more closely understood. And water is the one area where he's probably got less information available to him than in either of the other two. So we need to see how it binds in with water, with food and energy, so that we can understand a complex situation in a more intelligent way. Labelling is probably going to help in some senses. It might be that we get to something where there is a kind of warning sign associated with it, but if it just becomes a way of as it were, paying for the sin of buying a particular product, then it isn't going to change behaviour. What we've got to do is change attitudes to understand that overconsumption affects energy and carbon and food supply and water all jointly. And the interesting difference between the carbon dioxide and global greenhouse gases argument and water is that emissions of carbon dioxide is a truly global issue. When you emit carbon dioxide from anywhere, it affects everywhere. But the water issue is entirely localized, both in space and in time.
That's really interesting. I would like to talk a little bit more about food, if we could, because if I understand it, food agriculture is responsible for 70% of the world's water use. And a lot of that comes down to this notion of irrigation, that we can simply bring water into dry areas and grow lots and lots of food, most of which is being grown, as I understand it, in developing countries where there's a lot of water stress anyway. And I just, what needs to change with agriculture? Is it just that we need to stop expecting strawberries in February, or is it that we need to stop eating so much processed food, which is, of course, another aspect of rising acceptance of Western lifestyles, is a higher diet in processed food, which is also very water hungry. What needs to happen?
High-level question. I think it's obscene that we eat strawberries in February, and it's obscene that they're supplied. But it's not really a very big part of the global problem. The global problem is that there's an overall shortage or stress on the available food supply. And part of that is because in developing countries, about a third of the food that's produced doesn't reach the plate. And in this country, about a third of the food that is produced is thrown away once it has reached the home.
Can you see a point in the distant, or maybe not too distant future, where our food supply is really just dependent on what rainfall there is?
Yes, it's now.
That's scary.
If you look at commodity prices, they're quite closely linked now, certain commodities, to floods and droughts. And we know of a couple of companies who are looking at moving production because of a lack of water. I mean, the situation in Australia at the moment is fairly dire. I mean, I think, just to come back to the food point, the reason people buy Kenyan beans is because they're cheaper. And the reason they're cheaper is because we are being subsidised by Kenyan farmers, because we're taking their water to grow large amounts of food for us. Now, the problem is a lack of global regulation. And I know that always sounds bad and people don't like regulation, but a lack of joined-up thinking globally about managing catchments. And this is where this report is really useful, because it starts to talk about setting, not standards, but setting protocols for managing water at the local level. A good example is we used to grow a lot of tomatoes in the Isle of Wight. The Environment Agency in England and Wales, very good on water, very strong. So what they did was the Eastern Yar, one of the rivers on the Isle of Wight, was in danger of being over-abstracted. So they said, you can't expand. So what the tomato producers did was move to Portugal and Spain and Morocco. And then we had less people employed in semi-skilled tomato production on the Isle of Wight. We shipped our tomatoes in to the UK from those countries, and those countries are under major water stress. But the Environment Agency was happy that the Eastern Yar was protected. Now, the problem here is that there is no way of measuring impacts. And there's something called, again, this is a bit boring, but something called the Water Framework Directive, which is a piece of European legislation that's trying to look at standardising the way we abstract water and how much it's valued at and all that sort of stuff. And what we need to do, frankly, is to do that globally. We need to start looking at how water is abstracted, what the rules around that abstraction are. And the first thing to do, and again, this was in the report, is to try and set up some sort of global way of having local accountability for water. So no matter whether you are in a catchment in the UK or in a catchment in India, there is a local water management group. Now, unfortunately, I can't see this happening in the near future with all the other political things that need to be sorted out. But if we're going to solve the water crisis, this is what has to be done. Water can only be managed locally, but it needs a global framework for that management.
There's almost no country in the world that values water, gives a value to water itself. It only values the cost of moving it, treating it, supplying it, and so on. And South Africa has introduced this, but there's almost no other country in the world where water is given, assigned a value which has to be met by whoever is taking it. And so that would, I know it's a rather crude economic instrument, but it would be a tremendous step forward to say that you can't take this asset and assume that it's free except for the amount of work you have to do with it.
Except if you put a sort of pound value on water, what happens then? Does it just become another commodity? Does it become something that becomes privatized and therefore we don't have access to it? I'm worried about using solutions that involve the same pattern that's already sort of given us a boom and bust in the economy and with oil and things like that.
It's already happening. It's already happening because it's implicit in commodity prices. This is the problem. When you talk about coffee or you talk about pork or you talk about wheat, embedded within that, and that's why we call it embedded water, is the hidden cost of the water. So we are doing it implicitly. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very worried about the privatisation of water. I'm very worried about commodification of water and all those things. But at the moment, it's being commodified by stealth through agricultural and food prices. And it needs to be addressed. We need to have this debate. Otherwise, it will happen. At least if it has a specific value, then people at the local catchment level can say, well, hang on a minute, that's our water, and you're using it for this, you're stealing it off us. Yes. But at the moment, I mean, one very large fizzy drinks company in India abstracted very large amounts of water, and in the end was thrown out by the regional government because the cone of depression, that's basically the amount that the water was pulled out from surrounding areas, was so large that allegedly farmers couldn't grow crops. And there was no value associated to that water, so this large company was just allowed to pump as much as it wanted until the outcry was so large it was stopped.
Many aquifers around the world which are being depleted at a rate far greater than they're being replenished.
Well, this is. I have a question about how this water crisis is linked to land grabs, because at the moment you have governments and corporations buying large tracts of land in developing world in order to supply us with food. And you also have a lot of wealthy philanthropists buying up large tracts of land. And guess what? The water rights come with all of that. And local people have no access to water that they once had. And that seems to me a really disaster. That's by stealth as well. It's a disaster.
That doesn't just apply to water.
No.
I think the difference with water is that, again, because, as you said before, fortunately there's no commodification. There is, again, this commodification by stealth. And people are buying, as you say, tracts of land. The land itself doesn't have much value, but the fact that you can sink boreholes there and pull out the water does. And there are people land banking and water banking at a very rapid rate at the moment, yes. So
it's the new oil, as they say.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about solutions here.
Well,
I can.
in a crude way, we need to ensure that politicians in this country at least understand that water and water security is a lens through which all policy should be viewed. So every policy that has any potential impact at all, or component of water, needs to have a kind of chapter associated with what are the implications on water security and water availability of this policy. And we have a great deal to be thankful for, just in passing, to the European Union for the kind of legislation that has been imposed, as people would see it, on this country through the Water Framework Directive and other directives, which has increased the quality of our environmental legislation and our response to water much faster and much better than we probably would have been entrusted to do ourselves.
Gosh. Well, in terms of engineering, in terms of sort of building in water savings, is there a case to be answered that football clubs, golf clubs, skyscrapers should all be sort of harvesting rainwater and sort of, why is that not law?
Well, they should be harvesting rainwater, but how much more interesting would it be if you had golf clubs that were responding by not trying to maintain the status quo, but trying to produce golf courses that were responding to the climate that they found themselves in, or the weather conditions that they were encountering. Maybe you would want to water the greens, but you definitely wouldn't want to maintain the whole swathe of perfect greenery in a changing climate. So I think changing attitudes is probably more important than doing rainwater harvesting. Rainwater harvesting, it's a kind of no-brainer. Get on with it and introduce it into new buildings particularly. But it's almost more important to think about sustainable urban drainage in new built forms so that you prevent flooding.
But these sort of solutions, some of these solutions actually open the door to other problems. For instance, the genetic engineering of drought-resistant crops, which is a really contentious issue for a lot of environmentalists, certainly is for me. I mean, I worry that the solution is always going to be that kind of technofix, which takes us down a line that we don't want to go.
It depends what you mean by genetic modification.
I don't think we need to go down that route. I mean, the problem is when people talk about drought-tolerant gardens and drought-tolerant golf courses, they always think about reeds and spiky plants. They're of no use. They are not habitats for our natural species.
No.
What we need is, dare I say it, more boring, fundamental, basic stuff like mulches and bark mulch. And when you've cut the grass, put the clippings around the bottom of the trees because that holds the soil moisture in. Basic stuff that we used to do a long time ago, but now it goes in a skip. So it's forking over the greens when there's ice and snow, so you get a lot of the winter runoff, instead of running off and causing floods, soaks back into the ground. It's basic land management that unfortunately with large agribusiness and landscaping things we lost. And it's getting back to that simple local management, which is, again, comes back to what the report says. It says that you should be managing water at the local level. And that doesn't only apply in India and Peru and places. It applies here in the UK. We need to look after our local woodlands and things like this. And it is very simple stuff. Politicians love massive rainwater harvesting schemes and all these. It's just things like changing your shower head and making sure your tap doesn't leak and catching a bit of water in a water butt and putting mulch around your plants. Really, really simple stuff. The thing about water is, yes, it's another global crisis that we're going to be worried about, but the solutions lie in all of our hands, and they're really simple.
And what about industry? What about all these goods that we buy, all the mining that happens that uses water, all the sort of refining and the plastics and all this sort of thing? Is there a case to argue that really the best solution is just to stop consuming so much?
Yes, it is. But we need to be careful when we're talking about water that we don't try and solve everybody else's problem at the same time. And of course it is, but in the water sphere, if you like, it would be quite neat if we could develop building regulations that would allow us to have twin supplies in homes, so that people had untreated water flushing toilets and being used for non-potable purposes, and drinking water only where drinking is likely to take place. And we currently use 160 litres per person per day. And if you look at the Code for Sustainable Homes, they talk about getting down to 80 without too much difficulty, Code 5 and 6. And if you can get down to 80, then we should be working to around 80 litres per person per day. Those are the figures that we should be working with.
Wow, that's a big reduction.
In terms of what you were saying about goods, Just think, when you recycle stuff, you're not only recycling the thing, you're also recycling the energy and the water that's been in it. So every time you reuse the back of a sheet of paper, that's 10 litres of water. That's a lot. So again, it's quite simple things. We're not talking about everyone having to wear hair shirts and not ever buy anything ever again. But if they just think about these things when they do them, I think that has a big impact. And the CO2, which we touched on very early, it's about 1% of CO2 emissions in the UK is from treating and pumping water. It's another 5% heating it in the home. So it's about equivalent to aviation, although gases from aviation are released higher up in the atmosphere, so they have a bigger impact. But it's of the same order. And nobody protests outside my boiler. You know, you have people protesting at airports and saying this is really terrible, but people don't realise that the hot water they use and waste in their home not only has a water implication, but has a CO2 implication. And there are really simple devices you can use for showers, and knocking a minute off your shower and things like this will save on your energy bills and your water bills, and it will cut back on CO2 emissions, and it will reduce the water crisis. And it's really simple.
So really what you're saying is there's no way out of this for average people like myself. We've got to fit those shower heads. We've got to put the bricks in the cistern. We've got to manage our gardens a bit better. We can't just sort of say, oh, it's the politicians' fault, because it's everybody's fault, really. It's something that connects us all, this shortage of water.
We're not the shower police, so we're certainly not telling people what they have to do. But what we're saying is these things are actually really simple, and they will save you money as well. And if you need any help, please have a look at our website.
Well, the other thing is, as we're sort of talking through this today, and this is a slightly off-the-wall question, but I felt sort of challenged philosophically by this as much as anything else, that you know, water underpins so many of the human myths that we have. We build our cities next to water. It's a huge shift in consciousness, it seems to me, that has to take place in order for us to enact these changes.
It's not so much a shift in consciousness. I think we should maintain our mystical relationship with water. We have this very deep relationship which we should treasure and nurture. What certainly as engineers we needed to say in our report was that the solutions aren't necessarily going to come through building more stuff, and engineers need to respond more acutely and more holistically to the challenges, so that it may be around management, it may be around policy, it may be around enforcement, it may be around incentives, and to a very small extent it may be around new facilities, but probably it's around a whole lot of other things as well. We have to deal with water in a really mature way now and look at it between nations, between catchments, between users, between agriculture and end use and so on, so that we see water and how it appears in every part of life and political decision-making, so that we can make clearer and better decisions. The
problem with political decision-making, though, is that it often tries to reduce things rather than make them more complex. It tries to make them more simple, and it seems to me that this is not a simple problem.
There are some simple solutions.
Such as?
Well, integrated catchment management sounds a bit trite, but actually if you just took an integrated approach to managing the water basins that we have, as is done very much in this country and has been done very successfully in other countries, but not everywhere, then we would make huge strides. And if we were able to get transnational agreements, it would make a big difference. International boundaries of aquifers, that's water underground, that could be a potential source of conflict if we don't get that sorted out. So there's a huge amount of political work to be done.
Do you agree, Jacob, that it could be that simple?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out, because everyone says there's going to be wars over water. It's worth pointing out there are 10 times more cooperation treaties across boundaries than there have been wars. There are lots and lots of areas where countries are working together to manage cross-border aquifers, as we call them, in underground water storage or surface water catchments. And I think the point you made about water being difficult, I don't think it is. I think we have a fundamental link to water, and I think we fundamentally know that we shouldn't waste water. And I've never done the experiment, but I bet if you left the tap on and the light on in a bathroom and then watch people go in, they'd turn the tap off first. So it's probably easier to do than it is the carbon link, because we just know implicitly that water is important, and I don't want to use the word sacred, but you know what I mean. It's built into people's cultures and beliefs. I think people would be horrified if they knew the extent to which we were wasting it. And the idea that you should all just work together at a catchment basis and think about the way water is used is quite simple, and it's a cooperative model that humans are used to for thousands of years. And what we're trying to do is introduce that at an international level. So I don't think it's that difficult.
It's nice to think that people could actually work together on something, because quite often in environmental problems, we're working against one another. Countries are sort of competing, or they're trying to hoard, or what have you. And as you say, water, we can't live without it. So we do have to cooperate in order to make it work.
But if you look at the Nile, everyone goes on about water wars, and I think we've mentioned this, but on the Nile, there's a long treaties have been long on the Nile, and there have not been conflicts on the Nile, and that's a major basin.
So human beings can work together if they need to. That's actually a very good, positive note to end on. That is, in fact, all the time we have today. Next week, we are looking at art and activism, the most creative way to complain, as well as exploring the issues about why funding activism is so difficult. But for now, bye-bye.